Wittgenstein thought that there isn't any point of view outside of language where we can, so to speak, stand back and appraise the language game from a non-linguistic point of view. He thought there wasn't any Archimedean point from which we could get away from operating inside a language game, stand back and appraise the success or failure of language in representing reality. He thought that was impossible. We're always operating within the language game. We're always operating within some language game or other. There's no conception that we have of appraisal or of getting at the world apart from operating within a language game.
But now, what has happened to the real? For me to be able to see this as a hand, or that as a table, I must be in possession of the concepts hand and a table. And therefore, what I see reality as being is constituted by a whole conceptual structure that I have, which can be articulated in language.
That is a great deal of it, but I think in a way it goes even deeper than that for Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein really thinks, Wittgenstein is part of the movement in the past 100 years. It's a characteristic feature of the 20th century that we no longer can take language for granted. Language has become immensely problematic to us, and it has moved into the center of philosophy, and Wittgenstein is one of the great leaders in that movement. So he would certainly agree with what you just said, namely that reality divides up the way we divide it, that because we can only think of this as a hand or that as a table because we've got the relevant concepts, the relevant words. But the point is deeper than that. The point he wants to make is there isn't any such thing as thinking. There isn't even any such thing as experience as human beings have, adult, full-grown human being experiences. That cannot exist apart from language. Language permeates that at every point.
Now, a moment ago, you were saying that every language game has to be understood from the inside. One consequence of this is as follows, isn't it? Whereas the old logical positivists who'd been influenced by Wittgenstein's early philosophy were extremely dismissive of all religious talk, for example, and they thought that if I said something like God exists, that was just meaningless noise, exhaust. The later Wittgenstein would have not been intolerant in the same way. He would not have dismissed religious talk as being empty of meaning. What he would have said is, well, let's first of all examine how words are used in a religious context, how they function. Let's look at their use. Let's, as it were, get inside the religious language game, as he would have put it, and see how these terms are being used, and then we can judge whether they're being used legitimately, not legitimately, or whatever it might be.
Well, you have to be very careful about that last bit. You see, because what Wittgenstein would say is it's not our task as philosophy to appraise the success or failure of the religious language game. All we can do is describe how it's played. And the important thing is to see that it isn't played like the scientific language game. It's ridiculous, he thinks, that we should take religious utterances as if they were sort of second-rate scientific utterances for which there was inadequate evidence. Yeah. And he was always anxious to insist, well, we ought to look at the role that religion and religious utterances play in people's lives. That's the meaning of these utterances, to see what sort of a role they actually play in people's lives. And he disliked the idea that we should over-intellectualize this and make it into some kind of a theoretical enterprise where what we were concerned to was to criticize this and see if the evidence for the existence of God was up to snuff by scientific standards. He didn't like that. W.G. Grace once jumped on a chair in a meeting and said something Wittgenstein really approved of. He thought this was wonderful. Grace said something like this. He said, God doesn't want a head. Any old cabbage will do for a head. What God wants is a heart. Now, Wittgenstein liked that because he thought that was the language game in action. That was not trying to get outside it and do some sort of pseudo-scientific appraisal.
Yeah, but it is important, I think, for us to make the point that he didn't take a sort of anything goes attitude. I mean, he did think that philosophical puzzlement is characteristically caused by our using the terms from one language game as if they belong to another. By, for example, trying to judge, as I think you just said, trying to judge, say, moral talk or religious talk as if it were scientific talk. And that having got ourselves into these puzzles and problems, the way to get ourselves out of them was to pay very strict attention to the way the words that we were using normally functioned in
I think that's right.
In actual human discourse.
And he does have various ways that he summarizes this. He says philosophical problems characteristically arise when we take the word out of the language game where it's at home and then try to think of it as something sublime. We want to inquire into the nature of the good, the true, or the beautiful, instead of just looking at how these words are actually used in the language game where they get their meaning. But there's something you said that I want to take
that Wittgenstein makes between games and the use of language. There was one important aspect of it that we didn't take up, because we can't talk about everything at once. A game is a rule-governed activity, and language is a rule-governed activity, and has to be, because if I didn't follow certain linguistic rules, what I said would be unintelligible and wouldn't communicate or perform any of the functions I want it to perform. So I have to follow certain rules. Now, Wittgenstein argued that because that was so, there could be no such thing, even in theory, as a private language. And his argument to this effect has become one of the most controversial aspects of his philosophy. Can you say a word about that?
Yeah, it sure has. Well, I would be glad to. In a way, I'm reluctant to get into this hassle because there's so much junk written about the private language argument. But just let me say a little bit about it. First of all, you got to say something about rules. We've been talking as if the notion of a rule for Wittgenstein was unproblematic, but it wasn't. His notion of a rule is itself one of his important contributions to philosophy. What he thought was, first of all, that rules don't block off all eventualities, that language isn't everywhere bounded by rules. Nothing is everywhere bounded by rules. There are always lots of gaps left open by any system of rules. He gives the example of throwing a tennis ball when you serve. There's no rule how high you have to throw it. But I suppose if somebody could throw the thing 5 miles high and we had to wait all day, they'd make a rule. I mean, the rules are never final. Now, another thing he said about rules is that rules are always subject to different interpretations. And if you've ever been through the income tax laws, you know this. I mean, the American history of it is a series of different interpretations. So it looks to Wittgenstein as if there's a kind of skepticism that arises here, because if anything can be made to conform to the rule by some fancy interpretation, then anything can be made to conflict with it, and you wouldn't get either accord nor conflict. The rule would then seem to drop out as irrelevant. Now, his solution to that is to say, obeying the rule is a social practice. It's something we learn in society. Society just has ways of making people and training people to conform to rules. Now, he applies that to this whole private language problem. The problem of the private language is, could there be a language where I just named my own private sensations in a way that no one else could understand it? Now, the reason for all the fuss is that a lot of people in the history of philosophy have thought that must be the basic use of language. In the whole Cartesian
language
tradition,
must name inner experience.
That we get to the real world, the external world, by starting from our inner experiences, by starting from inside and working outward. Now, Wittgenstein wants to say two things about that. First of all, that isn't how the words for our inner experiences actually function. They don't name private objects. Rather, they're used in conjunction with public criteria, behavior, situations. So we're not, in fact, speaking a private language when we use sensation language. But secondly, and more controversially, he says we couldn't, in fact, speak a private language. We couldn't give a private, ostensive definition where we just sort of point inwardly to some private experience and name that experience. Because, he said, unless we can appeal to some larger social gathering, there won't be any difference between my thinking I'm using the word right and I'm actually using it right. So his discussion of the rules and the social character of rules is really what underlies his rejection of the idea of a private language.
And it's important for him to reject the idea of a private language, as you say, because he's reacting against a whole tradition of philosophy that goes back to, I suppose, Descartes, but certainly includes Locke, Berkeley, Hume, the empiricist philosophers, who say that we start by cognition of essentially private states of mind and infer the world or build up a conception of the world from that.
What?
Now, the later Wittgenstein seems to me to be saying this, that because the sum total of a word's possible uses constitute its meaning, in the end, what language means and what words mean depend on forms of life, on the social contexts within which they're used. And in fact, he uses that phrase, forms of life, a great deal. So that all the ultimate criteria of meaning are not personal, are not private at all. They are essentially social, are they not?
That's right. It's important to emphasize that the notion of use is itself a social notion. It's something that I do in conjunction with other members of a society, and it's only because I'm trained to respond in certain ways that we avoid this skepticism that says, well, anything I do can be made to seem to be in accord with some rule or other, or I could always interpret the rule in such a way that would come out in accord with it. And he does emphasize the idea that a language is a form of life, that we can't sort of carve off the language and look at it apart from the human activities where it actually has its meaning.